Hello, everyone. Dear We Empower members and friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and happy Friday. Welcome to the webinar. Today's topic, Youth Policies in G7 Countries, What Makes a Difference? The webinar is organized by the We Empower G7 program to showcase policies that champion young people's empowerment in G7 countries. The panelists will provide examples on how to be active and engaged to advance gender equality. Promoting economic empowerment at work in G7 countries is a program funded by the European Union and implemented by UN Women and the International Labour Organization. My name is Diana Rusu, and I will be the happy moderator today because this is a very interesting topic and dear to my heart. On behalf of UN Women, I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for spending the next hour with us. Together with our panelists, we will explore youth policies and practices that promote gender equality and women empowerment in the 21st century workplace. And of course, we will understand the incentives for public and private sector to respond to youth preferences and to develop and implement youth-responsive policies and practices that foster gender equality and women empowerment. We started this week celebrating the International Youth Day, recognizing and encouraging their energy, skills, and aspiration. The theme of International Youth Day this year was transforming education, highlighting efforts to make education more relevant, equitable, and inclusive for all youth, including efforts by youth themselves. This goal is rooted in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to ensure inclusive and equitable equality education and promote lifelong learning and opportunities for all. Here's our agenda for today. We have two presentations from our wonderful panelists, and then we will take a Q&A session, and we hope to have an engaged discussion. This said, if you have any question during the webinar, you can enter your question into the question box for the organizers or for the panelists, and we will be happy to respond. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Sabrina Groover, Young Diplomats of Canada. Sabrina is serving as a co-chair of a Youth 7 Summit, which serves as the formal side engagement to the G7 as a part of Canada 2018 G7 presidency. Sabrina spent over 10 years working in developing programs for youth academic conferences, focusing on the United Nations in Calgary, Seattle, Portland, and New York. Sabrina works with Nutrition International as a policy and advocacy officer to transform the lives of vulnerable people, especially women, adolescent girls, and children by improving their nutritional status. Sabrina, thank you for joining us today and for you to speak about youth policies in Canada. Over to you.
Hi, Diana and everyone else. Thank you so much for having me part of this presentation. I'm excited to be here and present on Canada's youth policy and what Canada's doing. So Diana, we can move it to the next slide. And the next slide after that. Perfect. So I'm going to structure my presentation here first kind of by describing the landscape of what both the policy landscape in Canada and the youth demographic landscape. So giving a bit of an illustration on what young people are concerned about and how the government has responded. And then I'm going to focus on my second piece in the results of the Youth 7 Summit last year, Youth Summit 2018, and talk about some of the recommendations that we had on gender equality, and they'll link together with what we've already heard from young Canadians. So one of the things that I think is most important today is that young Canadians are in the best position they've ever been to influence the agenda and make change. And the reason for that is that in 2019, young people, that's anywhere from 18 to about 35, will make up the biggest proportion of the Canadian electorate for the first time. And we already saw in 2015 in Canada that we had a very large number of young people engaged. We had 57% of young people vote, which was almost just over double the amount that voted in 2011 in the previous election, and it's expected to increase even more in 2019. And one of the reasons why we think this is so important is that allowing young people to be enfranchised through a vote and through democracy is one of the biggest ways we've seen that there's a way to encourage them to have their voices heard, but also be less apathetic about the political system, because now they can see themselves in that system. Where for a long time, because they didn't make up that largest percentage, they didn't see themselves in the system, and that led to a little bit more of the apathy that we saw. Next slide. So leading up to the 2019 election, there's a lot of things that we've seen that young Canadians are concerned about, but also feel good about. So broadly, young Canadians are optimistic about the future, they feel confident about Canada, and they feel good about their lives. But there's a sense of apprehension amongst them about their own personal futures. And a lot of that has to deal with their financial futures, job security, employment, and the precarity of the labor market that they have both been raised in and foresee as part of their future. And I think this is really important to highlight because it represents a significant break from a previous generation, which experienced a lot of stability in the terms of being able to find a job, being able to be employed for the long term, and not engage in what we see young people engaging in today, which is often having a side hustle or having, working in the gig economy, working 2 or 3 jobs at a time, working through university. All of these things are making young people uncomfortable. And this isn't a phenomenon just in Canada. During the Y7 last year, we heard that this was a phenomenon across the G7 countries and amongst youth across those countries. I think this is important because it provides a context for what the government really needs to focus on when it looks at creating policies for young people, as well as what the private sector needs to focus on when it looks at hiring young people. And this is not, this isn't really gender specific in this sense, but it still provides a landscape analysis of what is the outlook for young people and how are they going to get there, and what is the security that both the private sector and the government can provide for them. So I've listed a couple of the key things there that young people are concerned about: housing, job security, cost of living, climate change, and most importantly, mental health, which again is, I think, a break from what we've seen in previous generations. Young people are more active with respect to mental health, and they're more encouraged to speak out about it and to ask both private sector and government for supports that actually enable them to deal with those challenges. Next slide. So there is some sentiment that young people are still apathetic about the political system, in the sense that they don't necessarily see that politicians or decision makers understand their day-to-day lives and their challenges, or understand or see themselves reflected in the political system and decision making. So I think that's something that we're going to see change in 2019 in Canada, with a number of movements that are encouraging young Canadians to vote, with the number of with the number of initiatives that we've seen that have been started. And so hopefully that this is something that we can see actually evolve over the next year. And whereas young people, instead of seeing themselves disempowered, find themselves empowered and enfranchised by participation. Next slide. So I'm going to kind of move on to the areas of Canada's youth policy and some of the other things that Canada has done to empower young people. So in Canada, for the first time ever, in 2015, with the election of the last government, we had a Minister of Youth created, and that resided with the Prime Minister. And so I think immediately off the bat, that's a really incredibly strong signal to young people that their voices are going to be included, that the government wants to hear from them, but not just hear from them in a passive way, wants to hear from them in a way that empowers them to have influence and some sort of control over the decisions and the policies that are going to be developed that affect them. And so that was a strong break from previous, the previous landscape of youth. And I think one of the strongest things that we've seen between the Minister of Youth Development as well as the youth policy in Canada is that we're no longer thinking about young people and young Canadians as the voice of the future, but we're actually thinking about them as the voice of today. And that is significant in changing mindsets and changing thinking. Often I think we've heard people say, young people aren't paying taxes, so they don't know about the economy. Well, that's not really true, right? Youth pay tuition, they pay taxes on their tuition, they pay sales tax, they pay income tax if they have a job. So I think it's important that through some of these things we've started to recognize that they are fully participating in society, and that in this sense they need to now have their voices heard. Next slide. So in 2018, Canada did a consultation which garnered about 5,000 responses and developed the first ever Canadian youth policy. So those are what I've listed here is the two different buckets of what the youth policies, what the government will do and what the principles are. And again, a lot of it again is around creating meaningful opportunities for young people to be heard and respected, to make sure that there's accessible supports that meet the needs of youth, and make sure that they have equal access, the right to be heard, and that they can reach their full potential. And I think that those are, again, some fairly critical pieces to making sure that youth feel involved in their society and are encouraged to be part of civic duties. Along with the youth policy, the government also committed to doing a State of Youth report every 4 years, starting in 2020, which will identify both youth priorities, the state of how young people are doing, and reflect their sentiments and feelings of the day. We also committed, the Prime Minister also created the Prime Minister's Youth Council, which has young people directly part of sort of a advisory group, I guess you could say, that from across the country, a very diverse group of education backgrounds, employment backgrounds, representing, rural, urban parts of Canada, Indigenous peoples, and they essentially serve as an advisory committee to the government or the Prime Minister's office on some of the sentiments of youth. And again, I want to just put a caveat that not all of these are perfect, and of course some of them aren't fully representative or aren't fully engaged, but it is definitely a start to see that these policies are in place. And some of the other things that we've seen happen that are kind of like on the policy side that have supported young Canadians, is the commitment to include young Canadians on boards. So that's something that's being done both through the Government of Canada as well as an organization called Girls 20. And Girls 20 is focused specifically on getting young women on boards. And then we also saw some clear actions in Canada's most recent budget to support young Canadians. So a lot of that was around ensuring that young Canadians feel supported to be able to volunteer, to give back to their communities, to ensure that they don't feel confined by post-secondary education choices, to encourage young people to go into the trades where necessary. And then one of the key things that was driven by both the youth consultations and engagement with young people was a need to really address racism. And so the government committed to a certain amount of money to give to organizations dealing with youth on addressing some of the racism issues that they've seen. And so I think, again, like that's something that's obviously driven by that next generation. Next slide. So these are some of the priorities that were identified under the 2018 consultations before the youth policy was made. And I just want to highlight within this, and this is something that we've seen in other assessments and surveys as well, is that there's a real commitment amongst young people, and especially young Canadians, to social justice and social issues. So out of these priorities, we see that there's an emphasis on climate change. There's an emphasis on truth and reconciliation, which is a huge issue in Canada. And the emphasis on truth and reconciliation and the recognition that Canada needs to be better, Canadians need to be more active, and all Canadians need to be involved in promoting Indigenous rights and in promoting reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people is a real break from what we've seen in this country before. And I think that really sums up some of the sentiments of young Canadians here, that they're not looking at a world that is inequitable. They envision for their futures not only success for themselves, but success for their peers. And part of that is improving equality across gender, improving equity and accessibility, ensuring that things are diverse and inclusive, and then most importantly, ensuring that Canada rebuilds its relationship with Indigenous people, but not in a way that is tokenistic, but in a way that actually reflects meaningful involvement. So that's sort of like the landscape of what we're looking at here in Canada right now and what people are concerned with. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to move into here is some of the things that we saw as part of the Y7 last year. And a lot of this reflects kind of the sentiments that we heard from young Canadians. As part of the Y7, we were able to conduct digital consultations with young Canadians and receive over 500 responses to the issues of gender equality, the future of work, and climate change. So I'm going to focus on the gender equality piece here. So what I've got up here right now is the outcome that emerged from the Youth 7 Summit last year, which was a summit of about 32 youth from across the G7 countries, that focuses on the priority area of gender equality. And diving deep into the discussions that we had on gender equality, they were really focused on the regardless of women, but also the respect of gender identity, regardless of regardless of sexual orientation, or regardless of other discrimination. And what young people really focus on, and I think a lot of this came off of what we saw as the Me Too movement, is that we want to make sure that people feel safe, and that we ensure that people feel safe from sexual assault, and we ensure that people feel safe from gender-based violence, which is something that hasn't necessarily been addressed by youth previously to the last, say, 5 years. And if we go to the next slide, what we included here is what the specific calls to action that the youth asked for to the G7 heads of government. And so again, it's something that we feel during the discussions, young people felt that these were the things that really empower people to move forward, but also create an equity so that people don't feel victimized, people feel like they can be survivors and move forward with their lives, and they feel that there are institutional supports to actually progress on gender equality and not to kind of be stagnant. And within these conversations, one of the things that emerged both in the conversations at the summit, but also emerged as part of our consultations, is that there was an identification that oftentimes in these issues that we talk about with gender equality, they're identified as women's issues. And that's something that the youth at the summit and the young people in the consultation really wanted to get away from. That it's not meant to be a women's issue. It's not something that's just to protect women. It's there to advance equity and equality more globally. And what we've focused on really within that is addressing things like toxic masculinity and bringing in young men and boys into the conversation directly so that we can move forward not just by promoting gender equality broadly, but by having a conversation and making sure that everyone feels empowered to have their voice raised at that table. And so part of that really included that online harassment, youth mental health, and toxic masculinity in workplace culture. That was a big part of the discussion, and something that we saw that both the private sector and the government needed to come together to address, or at least create avenues or recognize the organizations that can address them more generally. And some of the other concerns that we heard from youth across the board, representation of women in decision-making and policy-making roles was low, and they felt that that really needed to be addressed. And I think that we've seen some of that change already. And then the last thing that they said that they really wanted to see is the recognition of domestic work and care. And that's interesting that we saw that in Canada as well. So that I think that that aligns with the idea that domestic work and care and the things like the SDGs are not just things that are happening in developing countries. It's something that's happening in Canada. We need to address it here as well. And that's something where we see the government can make a difference. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I think you touched upon several important messages, and it was useful for all of us to understand a bit better about the Youth 7 Summit and the Canada priorities. And two things stuck with me. First ever Canadian youth policy strategy, and then Canada's Youth Council. I'm sure that we will discuss a little bit more during the Q&A session. Thank you so much to the participants for sharing the questions. We will have a special session after the second presentation, and we will take it one by one, I promise, and we will try to be very quick and efficient so we can respond as many questions as possible. One thing that we would like to showcase and like a take from Sabrina's presentation was the financial security and also the job security and employment. And this seems to be the one concern expressed by the youth in all the G7 countries. So G7 governments have a vital role to play in addressing these issues, mainly by investing in skills development programs and vocational trainings. And I hope we can develop a little bit the questions and the thematic of bridging the skills gap and automation, and everything comes with that. Next panelist is Charlotte Bour, a French delegate at the 2019 Youth Summit of G7. Charlotte is a young humanitarian exercising in a fair trade non-government organization. Trained at Nanterre University in political science and philosophy and in King's College London in African development and leadership, Charlotte then turned to environmental issues and agricultural development. She was one of the French delegates at the Youth 7, the G7 of the Young, to negotiate and promote proposals to the G7 governments. Charlotte, thank you for joining us today and share with us good practices of youth policies in France and Youth 7 consultations. Over to you, Charlotte.
Hi all. Well, thank you very much, Diana, for hosting me in this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about subjects as important as youth engagement and gender equality. Thank you also, Sabrina, for your presentation that I completely follow. The French context is quite similar. We have a lot of youth, 16 million from 15 to 35 years old, but a feeling of non-representativity and only 20% of young people trusting French politics. So it's a major issue in the dialogue that we're trying to build. We're in a context where there are a lot of demands, but where youth do not feel trustworthy in the political sphere. As an example, the average age of is 54 years old, which shows that there's a real gap between the political sphere and the youth demands. Next slide, please. If we go back to the context of the G7 in France this year, so France has been chairing the G7 this year and has made a fight against all forms of inequalities as its major challenge. and inequality between men and women is one of the priorities, with 3 main objectives that you probably already all know. Firstly, the protection of women against violence, then the access of girls to education, and women entrepreneurship. So for the first time, what's really interesting is that France has decided to include all the civil societies organizations, or what we call the engagement group. So the Youth 7 that I represent is only one of them. You also have Labor 7, Women 7, of course, Business 7, Civil 7 for the NGOs, and already a lot of new engagement groups that were created this year because of the emulation around the G7 in France. What's interesting is that it's a big change within the political sphere to include the youth, but also to include women at the G7 and to have their voices heard in a context of this non-trust in politics. So we were all the engagement groups included in ministerials, in meetings with representatives of the governments, and it was really interesting to have this new kind of dialogue to promote our recommendations. So what is the Youth 7? So the Youth 7, you have also the Youth 7 that was in Canada last year. This year it was in France. It's a dialogue between the youth of the G7 countries and their leaders. The Youth 7 is one of the engagement groups, and it takes the form of a summit that brings together a delegation of young leaders, so between 18 and 30 years old, from each G7 country, but also from the European Union and the African Union. What was actually really interesting this year, I just noted in my head, was the number of girls and women, mostly women, in the groups. So we were almost 50 to this year's summit, and I think the parity was almost achieved. We had women on every group. This year, the Youth 7 split into 4 groups. We chose to focus on 4 inequalities: economic inequalities, gender inequalities, technological inequalities, and environment inequalities. And the number of women was impressive, and I think is also a way to link women and youth involvement. And together, all these delegates developed recommendations for heads of states and governments to draw attention to the concerns of their generation. So we went to different institutions and government bodies after the negotiations, the Senate, the Assembly, the entire ministries, but also institutions such as the UN and also the OECD to promote our propositions. The Youth 7 in France has existed since 2019 and 11, sorry. It was created by the Open Diplomacy Institute during the French presidency of the G20 and the G8 at that year in France, and it's mandated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this year by the presidency. To this year, the French propositions have been elaborated and challenged in collaboration with a coalition of civil actors, so NGOs, universities, but also artistic collective. And like Canada, we also opened an online consultations to have young people all over from France to send their recommendations, but also to comment and challenge our priorities. It was really interesting to learn from them and to travel to France to have also panels of reflection. We've had on the platform more than, I think, 1,700 engagements and 400 participants. And we built our entire program based on that consultation. If we go to the next slide, concerning gender policies in France, to tell you a bit more about the context of what's happening in France, we've had in the past years a lot of measures about gender equality in France. We've especially had, I've listed you a few of them in the screen. It was a lot about violence and harassment around 2018 and also 2016. We've had a major awareness campaign launched. It was Stop That's Enough. about sexual violence in the transports, but also a lot has been done about wage gaps in France that resulted in result obligation for companies, obligation of transparency, access to formations for women, but also parity report and inspection. We've also had a national action fight female genital mutilation and also discrimination brigade that the gender equality ministry launched with the police and Twitter account to denunciate, for example, sexual harassment in the streets. So a lot has been done, but without including the civil society's actors or the youth in the process. I think it is also a logic that goes beyond the state and European policies, gender equality, I mean, with the change for more equality of rights, more responsible business, more possibility for entrepreneurship, for example, in the OECD, but also in NGOs, local authorities, or the dynamics of companies, of the financial world, the SDGs. We can say that change is on its way for women and for youth, but that the political participation is still way more low than it should be, and we need more focus and open consultation and integration of youth in the policy and in decision-making processes at a global level. If we go on to the next slide, that's exactly the starting point that we took. Using all these existing structures, these existing laws and reforms that the government in France, but in all the G7 countries, how can we pursue further gender equality, especially in the involvement of youth? So that goes with all the U7 propositions that we recommended this year. Oh, next slide, sorry. And if I draw a particular focus on gender equality, but also on women and youth participation in policy, we've had a lot of recommendations. You can all find them online at the link that I put in the first slide. One of the main priority was, of course, to achieve gender equality at last, with the general commitment for G7 countries to commit to women's participation by designing all public policies with a feminist approach, especially health and education, so they will suffer from disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis and technological disruptions on top of existing economic inequalities. Next slide, please. We've had there a lot of propositions from the 4 different committees, so technology, economic, gender, and environment, with the main access on education, career opportunities, but also violence and inclusion in the workplace of women and of positions of power. So just to list to you a few of our proposition of policies for the G7 countries. One of them was to reform the school curricula by identifying and eliminating gender biases, both for masculinity and femininity notions, and provide trainings to educators on how to address implicit and explicit gender biases. Another one was to set a global example of inclusivity and workplace equity within existing organizations and structures. I think it's really important to know that what the youth were proposing during the U7 wasn't a complete reform of all the laws and all the structures that were existing, but only an application of the laws and a new vision of the existing power structures with the youth vision of it. In order to eliminate career barriers based on gender identity, the U7 of this year recommended, for example, to establish laws ensuring fair gender representation in companies' executive boards in all G7 countries, following, for example, the models of the French Copé-Zimmermann law, but also commit to encourage women equal and meaningful participation in public events, in diplomacy, mediation, negotiations, and all forms of diplomacy that they can have a place into. The Youth 7 of this year, and particularly the Gender Committee, of course, had a specific regard to commit to end online gender-based harassment and violence by creating or expanding legal frameworks that address digital media harassment as a crime and collaborate, of course, with platforms to prevent harassment. It was one of their main focus, and I think it's really interesting because it's a new sphere that's completely linked with all the technological disruptions that we're also witnesses in terms of inequalities, and gender inequality is completely linked with all the others. So it's really interesting also to see all the links that have been pushed forwards during the U7. Another engagement was to empower vulnerable population and consider that women as one of the vulnerable populations should be included in the design of adaptation and mitigation strategies. So that's for the environment, but in general, in all kind of policies where they are included. So not only include them in the policy, but also in the policy making. And of course, the technological committee also pushed forward propositions such as implement and promote principles on artificial intelligence that includes women and promote cooperation between all the G7 members, African nations, but also women NGOs that have a place within the digital revolution and within all kinds of disruptions. I complete. Next slide, please. We also have, of course, the economic committee, but I think I already mostly said most of the next slides. I got a bit lost in my presentation. Yeah, exactly. We're there. Sorry. It's the same. So what we wanted to say is that within these 4 countries, all the youth of all the 45 youth of the U7 of this year pushed forward the importance of having a debate on gender equality, but also linking it with the place of youth and equality in our societies. They are both marginalized groups that are completely excluded from politics, and we've seen that in all the countries and with all our fellows that we discussed. And I think it's important to see that gender equality is completely interlinked with all the different kinds of inequalities. It's as much in the workplace, as much on the internet, and of course, facing new challenges. The environmental crisis we're going to face, women are the first populations to be touched, and it's a really touchy subject, but it's really important to link women and youth in the making of the policies. Anyway, thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. It's important to highlight that despite the progress, gap still exists for women and girls engagement, including in the labor force participation, diplomacy, political participation. And we welcome all the advocacy work that the Youth 7 group did. I think both you and Sabrina provided us a great start for the discussion and to going a little bit to a more practical way. So we received a lot of questions. Not sure if we can get all of them, but we will respond in writing for sure. But a lot of questions are resumed into the practical terms. So as a youth in my community, what I can do, how I can engage. Charlotte and Sabrina, what you can propose to youth all over the world, especially in G7 countries. Sabrina, maybe you can go first.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I think that young people can do, so you're talking about like what young people can do in their own communities?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that I would encourage is to have conversations and to get groups together to have those conversations. So sometimes I think as young people, we might be waiting for a table to be made that we can take a seat at. And I would say that young folks should go out there and just create their own spaces and create their own tables. So a lot of that we've seen in terms of the grassroots level is engaging young women in politics. So the city that I'm from, the municipality, young women got together and they created an organization called Ask Her. And essentially it's focused on encouraging both young women, but not just young women, all women, to run for politics, just to ask her to run. And so I think that that's an example of a really good initiative that someone can just take on, right? You want to start a conversation, either hold something in person, hold a social media conversation, do a social media campaign on what people feel is a problem, and then start to brainstorm about initiatives to take on. And there's a lot of supports that are offered that I think people don't know. There's a lot of grants that you can get access to, and build up organizations. And I think that that's really key, is like working in your community, start the conversation, and engage your peers.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Charlotte, what are your views?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sabrina. I think one of the best way to start as a youth is not necessarily to look at big institutions, though you can also find programs for young involvements, or if you have a particular project, but maybe to start by your locality, the village, the city you're from, the municipality. How can you engage? Because there are existing programs for youth, for poor populations. You can also look at the work you can do with NGOs. Because there are many different fields to getting engaged into, whether you want to engage for women, whether you want to engage for NGOs, for particular fields. I think the best way is to make your own voice, like Sabrina said, and to look at programs that already exist. You don't necessarily always need to invent the wheel or to look at new possibilities. You just need to talk to the good person, go and see the local council. Is it responsive to your demands? Go see whatever people you see in the street that have an influence and that have a power of decision, to go and present your projects, or to just be involved in the policies of your city or your regions, or whatever kind of public sphere that you have access to.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I might say that via UN Women social media, We Empower social media, and in general via We Empower program, we are trying to share all the links and opportunities and events. And this is an easy way to engage, as well as following the organization of your choice based on the subject, and to kind of make your voice heard. Robert is asking, what tools do you use in Canada and France to determine what young people want? Acknowledging that the world is a bit tired of polling. So what would be your suggestion, Charlotte and Sabrina?
For us, we did, I guess, essentially a poll. We did consultations with young people in the lead up to the Y7 2018. So we created a couple of different digital forms, and we put them out for engagement with young Canadians on social media, as well as we contacted certain youth groups in Canada that represented the different areas, like urban youth, rural youth, Indigenous youth, marginalized youth, and we asked them to kind of answer this questionnaire so that we could get their feelings directly on the issues in a long form kind of survey. I think some of that's I would say, like, still the best way to engage people is to actually just let them have their voices heard. One of the other things that we have done in the past, or we've seen that's been successful, is we've seen a lot of like policy lab pop-ups. So for example, an organization called Youth Climate Lab in Canada runs this policy lab pop-up, and they get a bunch of young people in a room and they do a bit of a hackathon on policy with respect to climate change. So I think that's another really good way of getting people in the room, just allowing them to talk, have their voices heard, and then around the side taking notes so that eventually you can develop a report out of that. For the information that I presented at the beginning of my part, we did get that information from polling, which is still we found to be effective.
Thank you, Sabrina. Charlotte, can you share some effective tools from France or Y7 maybe?
Yeah, I think it was almost the same process that we used. So we also did a consultation this year with more than 1,700 engagements and 400 participants. What was really interesting is that they could not only recommend it, but they could also comment and challenge the existing ones that we uploaded online. So we've literally built our entire program and the French proposition for the U7 based on this consultation. The other process that we use that I find even more interesting is that we went all over France to different regions, so not only cities, but also the countryside, maybe poorer areas, and we did consultation, physical consultation, I would say. We did panels of reflection with universities, with artistic collective, but also youth collectives and NGOs, and we asked them what were their priorities concerning this year, the G7, and all forms of inequalities that they were facing. I think that we tried to touch all the layers of the youth population in France, though it's really hard. But I can't wait to hear more propositions, more recommendations, and more comments on our propositions, because it's only this way that we're going to make it evolve, an ongoing process that we want to improve. So all propositions are good.
Thank you, Charlotte. A lot of young leader fellows from Women Deliver saying hi to you and Sabrina, and I assume the youth community is vibrant all over the world, and somehow for social media or posts or different activities, you all are connected. We talked a lot about the importance of government and collaborating with the government, but I mean, this is evident that private sector is a very important sector. And a recent study, for example, by Case Foundation showed that millennials and Gen Z are passionate about making the world a better place. And this is reflecting in their job choice, in their activities, and so on. How do you see this kind of collaboration and connection with the private sector, and especially regarding to the responsible business conduct? Maybe if you cannot respond from the youth perspective, in general, from your own perspective, based on the changes that you saw for your peers and in your own community.
I think the private sector, of course, plays a significant role in not only enabling youth to be empowered and to be effective, but especially for women to be empowered and to be effective. And I think one of the biggest things that we've seen in Canada specifically, I'm not sure about the other G7 countries, is the inclusion of women on boards. And the reason why that is important is just having women employed in a company is obviously good, but if they're not in a leadership position, then they're not able to really be at the table where the decisions that are made are going to make structural changes or impact the existing, male-driven or patriarchal-driven structures within a company. And so that's why I believe that Canada's recent legislation enacted that at least 20% of the board needed to be women. And I know there's a lot of disagreement over quotas, for example, but it is one step, and it is a small step in the right direction to get their voices out there, regardless of how they're getting to that stage. And then the other thing I would say is like making work policies more flexible. So the organization I work at, Nutrition International, one of the policies we've advocated for that can be done at the private sector is, for example, like breastfeeding policies or childcare policies. And those are two examples of where you recognize that, the importance of these things that women have to do, and that you create policies that enable them to be able to do those things. And especially childcare, I think, is a huge policy initiative across a lot of the G7 countries to ensure that women can be at work effectively. So I think there's a lot of roles for the private sector to play. The other thing I just wanted to mention quickly is that there's also a role for the education system and for schools to play. And UNESCO right now is running the Global Schools Advocate Program, which is a program that engages youth with local schools to get them to learn more about the SDGs and to teach about the SDGs. And the reason why I think that's important, because it's foundational to a learning structure to encourage people to think about the SDGs, to think about gender equality from that very first time they step foot in a classroom. And so that when they get to that stage where they're employed in the private sector, or they get to a position in government, they've already been thinking about this for 20 plus years. So I think that's another way to make change within the system.
Thank you. Charlotte, what do you think? What are the characteristics for France?
I think it's mostly the same. We've had a lot of changes on the board. We've seen in big companies in France, women taking the lead, not only for small teams, but taking the direction of entire enterprises. Another step that has been taken in France is the wages, of course, and the gap that we have for women and men. We've had several measures launched by the government, but also by the private sector itself. But I think there's another big step to take on gender equality in the workplace. What you also have is within these companies, the fact that women sometimes also face violence. It's not only about wages, it's not only about power position, but on the daily basis, the relationship that you have with your co-workers. I've also seen that as an evolution. We have in a lot of enterprises HR referent for gender violences or for harassment, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago. So I think that's also a big change, not only in the position of women within the board, but also as an individual within their company, to be protected, to feel safe, and to have a referent that they can talk to if there are issues or harassment in the workplace. So I think the importance of the private sector is essential. It's where you also have a lot of economic inequalities for women, and it's also a place that we need to work with, and that work change and a lot of new changes have to be made.
Thank you, Charlotte. Indeed, committed companies lead by example, and showcasing their commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment is essential, but also community leadership and engagement can take many forms, and you and Sabrina mentioned several of them, and hopefully a key motivation is to respond to consumers' preferences to buy, for example, from companies that are active in the community and support community initiatives, or to include the responsive procurement practices. So, and it's just several, right? We have a creative now way to engage and to be more participatory. I would like to thank all the participants for their questions. I understand that we have only 1 hour and the time is limited, but maybe we can make a promise to select 5-6 questions that are most relevant and were repeated several times, and to come back with a recording of this session and with some responses to the most strategic questions that you were interested to ask. We also wanted to mention that the year 2020 will mark several important milestones for gender equality and sustainable development, including the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, one of the most comprehensive blueprints for women's rights worldwide. UN Women is determined to make sure that young people are in the driving seats of these galvanizing moments and contribute to all the stages of a global review process and the Generation Equality campaign. I would like to invite my dear colleague Mariana to share more details with all of us. She is representing today UN Women Youth Voice. Mariana, over to you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Wonderful. It's so good to hear this conversation. And as you know, with the G7 countries, UN Women is also at the intersection of mobilizing governments and civil societies. So you may be asking why 2020 is such a big year. We are fast forwarding to be observing the 25th anniversary of Beijing, which is the most visionary agenda for the empowerment of women and girls everywhere. So what UN Women is doing is bringing together the next generations of women's rights activists with the gender equality advocates and visionaries who were key players 2 decades ago. So collectively, these change makers of all ages and genders can tackle the unfinished business of empowering women through a new groundbreaking multi-generation campaign that we have called Generation Equality. And that's for realizing women's rights for an equal future. Our campaign demands equal pay, equal sharing of unpaid care and domestic work, an end to sexual harassment and all forms of violence against women and girls, healthcare services that respond to their needs, and also their equal participation in political life and decision-making in all areas of life. Next, please. So as you can see here, despite some progress, real change has been agonizingly slow for the majority of women and girls in the world. It's time to be leaders in your communities and take action. So we are working closely with a group of young activists who we call the Beijing 25 Youth Task Force, and they're coming from diverse backgrounds in shaping our engagement with young people around the world. As you know, representation matters, and this group is inclusive of intersectional complexities. That includes marital status, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, indigenous and ethnic identities, as well as refugee or migrant statuses. Next. So with that, over the past decade, feminism has acquired a new dynamic and visibility because of the activism of young people, such as yourselves who are listening today. We are living in an exciting time for you to showcase your innovative and dynamic ideas to tackle some of the biggest obstacles we face. You know the different issues that affect you personally as well as your community, and that is truly powerful knowledge. If you want to speak up for yourselves, and for those who have been silenced, stigmatized, and shamed for far too long, we as UN Women invite you to join us in our Generation Equality campaign. In the coming months, we hope that you stay tuned because we will have very useful resources and action points released, and that can be used to mobilize others and actively engage locally, nationally, and globally. So thank you for your time, and I hope that you stay tuned and join us. You can follow the conversation using Generation Equality hashtag or hashtag Beijing25. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. We will make sure to do so. And together with important youth voices from the Youth 7 Summit and organizations that are representing the voices all over the world, particularly today we're speaking about G7 countries, we will make sure to be active today. And as Sabrina mentioned, it's important not to think about only the future, but also today actions that lead to the future. We would like to mention that we are doing our best into putting together a series of webinars on different topics so that we can tackle the aspects of engagement. And the next one, please join us, it's on 22 of August, Preparing for an Automated Future, Key Consideration for Attracting and Strengthening the Talent of Women at Work. And as always, we are trying to be effective and to do our best. And your feedback is always important. So if you don't mind, I would like to take 2 polls at the end just to understand if we can do anything else to change or to improve our webinars or to provide you more information. So we have the question, After this webinar, how informed are you with the youth policies? It's important for us to know if all of us provided you enough information or if anything else is needed, so we can do it after the webinar immediately. Several more seconds so we can provide the response. Thank you for staying additional minutes and for your response and selecting the appropriate option that it fits your opinion best. Okay, once we have 75% voted, I will close the poll. Okay, it seems that majority of you are informed and well informed, but still we will provide all the responses and some suggested resources, including the recommendations from the Youth 7 Charlevoix and Élysée. So stay tuned for those materials. And we have a second question about overall how you are satisfied with this webinar. You can take it from the thematic perspective, presentation, organization, wherever you want. All the feedback is welcome. Thank you for your responses. It seems that we did a great job. You are satisfied with this webinar, and thank you for providing a positive feedback. Sabrina, Charlotte, and myself are saying thank you for your participation, thank you for listening to us, and thank you for being today with us. On behalf of We Empower program, I would like to especially again thank Sabrina, Charlotte, and Mariana for joining us today and to providing important perspective, good practices from Canada, from France, and G7 in general. It was a great conversation. I hope we can carry on and provide more information forward. Until next time, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. See you soon.